this. We're just going to wrap up the class, just a couple things to kind of point out and try to be very brief here. The last thing I want to do on the last day of class is just talk too much. You know, but just kind of try to wrap up a few ideas and maybe a few loose ends here. Main point, and if there's one thing that I hope you walk away from, particularly this quarter, there are many problems that we face in regards to the structure and composition of our forests. These are problems that have emerged over long periods of time, and they don't have simple answers. I challenge you to work on them anyway, to do something. Even the smallest thing, the most insignificant, what seems insignificant is a positive thing is worthwhile, even if it's tiny. So, you know, these kinds of like hazardous fuel conditions, these dense forests and so forth, our wildfire problems and the other things that are associated with it, like, you know, damage due to flooding. They're hard problems. You as an individual person are probably not going to solve these, but even a small contribution is worthwhile because the way you eat an elephant is one tiny bite at a time. And if we're all out there doing things that are sensible, the overall situation will improve. So, like I say, I challenge you, get some treatments done. Get some fire on the landscape. You know, go through the hard work of getting that stuff done and making a positive contribution. Yeah, do something even if it's small, because what's at risk is quite a lot. You know, the damage to the environment, loss of timber, loss of homes and structures, and the pollution that comes from really damaging wildfire. And I'm pointing to this runoff here, the erosion and so forth. There's one thing that one loose end I wanna point out here, and it's the this concept. It's called the conspiracy of optimism. It's coined by a historian at Arizona State University, this guy Paul Hurt. You may or may not know that, you know, America, we did this amazing kind of radical thing by preserving all this land, making public huge tracts of land, primarily in the West, for the purpose of protecting land, sustaining forests, sustaining forest production, protecting watersheds, doing all this stuff. Teddy Roosevelt, just a pioneer in doing this, and one of his primary advisors was Gifford Pinchot, who founded the Forest Service. He's an interesting guy. You would say he's the first American forester. He's educated in Germany, and kind of an interesting thing that's a little bit foreign now, but he believed that all forested land should be managed for timber. And he was really not in favor of the national park system because he thought that those places should also be managed for timber. Now, here's the wild thing, and I know that some of you are like working on white bark pine and that sort of thing, those kinds of forests for your project, and those forests don't produce timber. They produce like gnarled, kind of crazy, you know, wild trees, and they're great. They have their own value, but, you know, don't try to grow really valuable saw logs up there because it's not going to work. And that's where he was a little off. I think he was a little biased from his work in Germany. He saw, oh, we can, you know, have productive forests everywhere, and that's not really the case in the West. He has a long-lasting, often positive legacy. But somewhat tarnished by not recognizing forests beyond timber value. And the odd thing about him is, not long after he left Germany and came back to the United States with these ideas about how to manage forests, German forestry started to change, where the Germans said, there's more value than just timber here. The wildlife has value. We should manage forests for water as well as wood, and frankly, some forests are just never going to be profitable, so we shouldn't manage them. We shouldn't pretend that they will be. Anyway, this is That's what happened. And you have this weird thing now, still a problem. The Forest Service sells timber but does not harvest it. And its budgets are for road building and everything else that timber sales rely on. But it creates a strange thing where the Forest Service has the incentive to get timber harvested, but not necessarily to invest in silviculture. And those things are different. There's the whacking and stacking, and there's the growing of the trees, going in and thinning and planting and using herbicides or fire and so forth. So unfortunately, for decades, the federal government subsidized road building, but didn't really invest in silviculture, and succession took over. And a lot of the problems that we have with, say, spotted owl and our loss of old growth forests is because of this, what is a policy dynamic. And on top, we have some structural problems that are in the Forest Service with how it works and what its incentives are. And then we've got fire and fire suppression. Since 1920, the federal response to fire has been to put them out. And for decades, they were very effective at that. But again, succession takes over, and our forests are now often so dense that, as a friend of mine put it, we pour money on fires until it rains. That's our fire management policy. Not necessarily managing forests before fires happen in order to make them more resilient. And policy has started to shift, but it's a difficult term. Anybody aware of this book, Young Men and Fire? I mentioned it. Yeah, it's really good. If you're interested, it's just interesting book. It's just an interesting book, period. But particularly if you have even a passing interest in fire. But it tells a lot of this story. Yeah, and that's the big thing. Just these problems are big. They're going to take multiple careers, multiple generations of people, and I hope you work on them. I hope you do, because I certainly haven't been able to solve them, and no one person is going to solve them. The only way we're going to make the world a better place is by one little tiny, seemingly insignificant thing in isolation, insignificant, but that's how we tackle these problems. And here's just another example of that. And I'm not going to go over this, but because the last couple of things have kind of gotten scrambled, but I did just put in this slide here because I had intended to come back to these questions, and in Klaus Putman's chapter that we read, talking about scale, talking about where silvicultural planning fits in, how do you create resiliency, these kinds of questions. We have a role in that. We can make a positive difference. Again, get some fire on the landscape, do some thinning, do something that makes sense for a particular piece of land that you might be responsible for managing. Do something, even if it's tiny. Yeah, and define your management goals too. What do human societies need forests to provide? And then just the last point, the absolute last point of the class, and this is one of the things that is central to the topic of succession, which is what this whole last chapter of the class has been about. There is such a thing as hysteresis. It's a delayed response. It's a kind of ecological memory, and that's that forests are a record of what has happened to them in the past. So the problems that we face with them have roots in they have roots in what we have done to them, what we have done with them or to them in the past. And we have forest management, perhaps more than many other kinds of natural resource management, are especially sensitive to what has happened in the past. That's because forests grow slowly. They grow and change slowly. they are changing. They are changing all the time. They are dynamic things, even though they might not really look like it in the course of a couple of years. You know, like the time that you're here at Cal Poly, the knob cone pine forests on East Questa Ridge are going to look the same pretty much the day you get here and the day you leave. But they are changing. They are dynamic, and something like a wildfire up there would change a lot. Management can control all this. We have a role. It's not out of our control. There is a time and a place for us, and I would say that it's frequent that we have a role, and that even that we have an obligation to do something about it. I mean, and if we don't, our problems with wildfire, water, so forth are just going to get worse. Cool. So that is our class. That is